In any army in the world, one of the cornerstones of soldier training is discipline. Without it, a military unit simply cannot function as a single organism. But a high level of discipline is achieved not so much by carrots as by sticks. Moreover, these sticks can be divided into three types. The first is official punishments, enshrined in the Charter. The second is unofficial measures of influence, which are rarely written about in documents, but which the soldiers themselves are well aware of. And the third, the most severe option, is direct physical influence, when the offender can simply be beaten up. But this rarely happens and, as a rule, only in extreme cases when the offender has completely lost control. When it comes to official penalties, minor violations are usually punished with a reprimand or a severe reprimand. At first glance, it seems that the punishment is not so bad, but it all depends on the status of the serviceman. Contract soldiers, for example, take such measures seriously. Penalties directly affect their salaries, bonuses, and prospects for further service. For conscripts, however, this punishment seems much milder. In essence, the only thing it threatens is a restriction on discharge. In other words, a reprimand may be the reason why a soldier is not allowed to leave the unit for the weekend. And although formally this is a trifle, in reality for many conscripts, discharge is the only opportunity to escape the routine and feel like a civilian, at least for a little while. But army practice shows that statutory punishments do not always work. That is why, in the harsh realities of military service, unofficial methods of discipline are also used. For every possible violation of discipline, there is always a special way to teach the offender a lesson. The most common method is so-called social pressure. Its essence is simple. The entire collective is turned against the offender, turning his life in the barracks into a real nightmare. This is done in different ways. One of the most popular methods is collective punishment. For example, because of the mistake of a single soldier, leave is cancelled for the entire company or platoon. As a result, the other conscripts, who have been deprived of the opportunity to go home or even take a walk outside the unit, begin to feel outright hatred for the person who let everyone down. Such situations not only knock some sense into the offender, but also clearly show everyone else that in the army, you are responsible not only for yourself, but also for your comrades. In the army, collective responsibility has always come first, and therefore punishment for the misdeeds of one person usually falls on the shoulders of the entire company or unit. This creates an atmosphere where everyone understands that your mistake will inevitably affect everyone else. The most trivial examples are when there was a snitch who complained to the higher-ups, then you could be sure that the next day the entire company would be put through their paces. And not just formally, but the full program. Formations, marching, hours of drill training. And all this just because one person decided to show their integrity or simply suck up to the bosses. If someone didn't perform the drill elements correctly, didn't keep information, lost their step, or made mistakes on the parade ground, the whole company could be made to march on the asphalt for hours until they achieved synchrony. If a soldier fell behind during a cross-country run, everyone was stopped, and the unit began to do squats, push-ups, or stand in a flash 1.5 position until the culprit caught up with the rest. The most shameful and morally difficult punishment was that the entire company had to perform physical exercises, rocking, falling, getting up, squatting again, while the offender simply stood aside and watched his comrades suffer because of his mistake. You can imagine how the group treated him after that, with anger, contempt, and resentment. In the army, such things are not forgotten, and sometimes such pressure is more effective than any reprimand or arrest. But the army's ingenuity did not end there. There were also so-called specialized methods of education. For example, smoking in the wrong place could result in a cigarette butt funeral. From the outside, it looked ridiculous. Several people with serious expressions dug a real grave, lowered a cigarette butt into it, covered it with earth, and might even stick a cross in it. But for the offender himself, it turned into a humiliating and memorable punishment, after which he would hardly want to repeat the mistake. There were also more severe, joking punishments. For losing a machine gun, even a training one, they could be forced to carve it out of wood and carry this homemade model everywhere. But there is an important nuance here. If the weapon was really missing, then it was no longer a matter of jokes. It was immediately punishable by a tribunal and prison. Therefore, such wooden machine guns appeared only in cases where weapons were deliberately hidden by colleagues for fun or to teach an inattentive soldier a lesson. This happened especially often with small items from the kit. For example, oil cans were constantly being stolen from our pouches. It was easier than easy to do this. Just walk up from behind, pull it out unnoticed, and that's it. And then the poor guy would run around the barracks, turning over lockers and searching beds, because you couldn't turn in your automatic weapon for storage without the full set. The army also had its own unique methods of punishment for minor skirmishes and silly fights. One of the most unusual and memorable ones was called, "I love you, brother." The essence was simple and ridiculously absurd. The brawlers who couldn't agree on something were ordered to take turns lifting each other up like a groom lifting his bride and squatting down, loudly saying, "I love you, little brother." It looked so funny and ridiculous that even the most embittered guys started laughing. As a result, the fighters made up pretty quickly, because the anger evaporated and the laughter did its job. And what's most interesting is that this method really worked much more effectively than any formal reprimands or dismissals. There were also more practical punishments for seemingly minor offenses. For example, if a soldier kept his hands in his pockets, he could be forced to sew the pockets shut with all their contents inside. Once we had a case where a guy was in such a hurry that he didn't even take the change and a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket. He sewed everything right through. Of course, it didn't last long, and after a couple of days he unpicked the stitches, but he learned his lesson right away. Hands in pockets, no more. For wearing headgear incorrectly, a cap pulled down too low or a hat pulled up too high, the punishment could be much more original. For educational purposes, they were forced to pull it down over their ears, so that the soldier looked like a character from a comedy film. In the summer, it was even tougher. They could give you a winter hat and order you to wear it all day under the scorching sun. It's funny to remember this now, but back then, no one was having fun. Sweat was pouring into our eyes, and it was strictly forbidden to take off our headgear. However, these humorous methods were not always used. In most cases, if it was necessary to quickly restore order and discipline in the unit, a universal remedy was used: physical exercise. It was a kind of universal cure for any misdemeanor. With a 70% probability, for any mistake, you would be sent to pump iron. Forgot the regulations. Lie down and do push-ups. Addressed an officer without the proper salutation? Get up and do squats until he says, "Enough." Didn't jump up when the commander entered the room? Get a series of endurance exercises. It was especially hard when someone made a mistake but didn't want to admit it. In such cases, everyone was punished at once. The unit began to exercise together, doing push-ups, squats, planks, or 1.5 flashes, and this continued until the culprit was found. And it was not always the person who had actually messed up who was found to be the culprit. Usually, the person who could not physically withstand the strain and was closest to fainting would end up confessing voluntarily, just to stop the collective torment. Unfortunately, this happens quite often. For those who are not familiar with army slang, let me explain: swinging does not mean calmly lifting a barbell in the gym. It is a whole complex of exhausting exercises that come at you unexpectedly and without any preparation. Swinging means standing in a half bend position where your legs burn and your back cramps, catching butterflies, waving your arms sideways hundreds of times in a row, squatting in sync with a brotherly grip when you take your colleague's hands and you sit down in unison until your legs can no longer hold you, and, of course, doing endless push-ups. It may seem like, so what's the big deal? I can do 100 push-ups at home, nothing will happen. But this is an illusion. At home, you do push-ups at your own pace. You can stop, catch your breath. But in the army, everything is counted at a variable pace. 1, 2, 3, 4, faster, slower, freeze. And then your arms get tired instantly. After a couple of minutes, your muscles start to burn so much that every new movement becomes a real challenge. And then it's no longer about sport, it's pure torture, where you do every push-up literally through the pain, fighting with yourself. The worst punishment is to be roasted in the music room. For those who don't know, the music room is an army drying room, a windowless room with heat guns that make it super hot. The air is so heavy and stuffy that it's hard to breathe even when you're not moving. And when you are sent there to swing, it turns into a real hell. Sweat pours down in streams, clothes stick to your body, and your eyes fill with salt. After 10 to 15 minutes, you feel like you are not exercising, but slowly suffocating, boiling in your own sweat, and about to collapse. After the music, many people went outside barely alive, staggering as if after a marathon. In some units, they like to use the so-called thinking paratrooper pose. To illustrate, you squat down, put your elbows on your knees, and prop your chin up with your palm. It looks like you're sitting calmly, almost resting. But try sitting like that for an hour, not 5 minutes. Your back cramps up, your legs go numb, and your neck aches so much you want to howl. After half an hour, your brain literally screams, "Get up!" But you can't. And all this is accompanied by comments from senior soldiers or officers. "Well, philosopher, thinking about eternity?" Some badgers, senior soldiers, will say in their comments, "Yes, we trained like this every day, there's nothing wrong with it." But the difference is that training is a conscious action when you have a goal and a desire. And punishment is coercion, devoid of any meaning. You understand that no matter how many push-ups you do, no matter how long you sit in the 1.5 position, there will be no result except pain. And that's what breaks your psyche. Any action in the army, even the simplest one, can turn into torture. If you can easily do 100 push-ups, they'll make you do 500. We had one memorable incident that many in the platoon still remember. At that time, we set what you might call our personal record, 546 push-ups. And all this for a piece of candy wrapper in his pocket. The story was this. One of our guys was so careless that he had so much trash, papers, and candy wrappers in his pockets that he was punished with several thousand push-ups. Well, you understand, it's impossible to do several thousand at once. Even a superhuman couldn't do it. So we took pity on him and decided to divide the punishment among everyone, turning it into a collective test. Since then, we've had a special rule. If one person falls to the floor, the whole company does 10 extra push-ups. And so on, until the counter reached a record high. Someone from the outside would probably say, "That's impossible. What do you mean, 546 push-ups? The human body can't withstand that much." And I wouldn't have believed it myself before. But the army very quickly erases all boundaries and ideas about the body's capabilities. In the barracks, you realize that a person is capable of enduring much more than they think. The body works to exhaustion, the brain shuts down, and all that remains is collective anger and discipline. And then you begin to understand that such punishments, no matter how absurd they may be, bring people very close together. Completely different guys from different cities, with their own characters and outlooks on life, become one through such collective squats and push-ups. But that's just the beginning. In the next video, I will definitely talk in more detail about how collective punishments strengthen the spirit, but now I want to move on to the most acute issue, what in the army is called getting a beating. In our company, this was quite real, and you could get it in 2 cases. The first was for a really serious mistake, especially if someone else could have suffered because of you. It's simple and understandable. If you screw up, you get the full treatment so that others won't be tempted to do the same. But the second case is much more insidious and, to be honest, the most common. This is when you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And here, don't look for any logic. You can get caught, literally from anywhere and for anything. Here's an example. We had a guy, an ordinary, quiet soldier who never got into trouble and didn't have a bad reputation. But one day, he just had a bad day. That was it. Fate decided to play a cruel joke on him. At that moment, he ran into a tipsy sergeant. Instead of walking past him, the sergeant ran up and kicked him right in the chest. The reason? The most ridiculous one, allegedly for dirty washing machines. Can you imagine? The guy had nothing to do with those machines, but who cared? Such situations are a separate category of the Army lottery. In ordinary units, especially in peacetime, mass beatings of soldiers, as they like to show in movies or scare people with in horror stories, do not happen. Constant checks, regular physical examinations by doctors and supervisory authorities make such things practically impossible. However, this does not mean that punishments do not exist. There are plenty of them, and each is inventive in its own way. The most that sergeants or senior non-commissioned officers can afford to do for a serious mistake is to deliver a couple of short blows to the torso or miss with a fist to the back, because such actions leave no obvious marks. This is the best-case scenario for them and the worst-case scenario for you. Sometimes they would simply deflate your tires. That is, hit you so hard that you couldn't breathe for a few minutes and you folded in half, as if a car had run over your tire. Similar sparing, but extremely unpleasant methods included the legendary armor-piercing plywood and the so-called musical moose. Plywood is when you are hit on the back or chest with an open palm so that the sound echoes throughout the barracks, as if a sheet of plywood had been slapped. The musical moose is a separate story. Someone stronger grabs you by the ears and slaps your head with their palms, causing your ears to ring and buzz as if a whole herd of moose had passed by. A blow to the throat with the edge of the palm, which in the army is called a brick or cookie, was particularly harsh. The pleasure is questionable. It instantly takes your breath away, makes it impossible to swallow, and the blow itself feels like a piece of brick being inserted into your throat. Personally, I once received such a powerful cookie that for 2 days afterwards I couldn't even swallow soup properly, let alone more solid food. It wasn't life-threatening, but the memories of it are still vivid. The punishment for not having a collar, a thin white strip on the collar of a gymnastics shirt, which every soldier was required to sew on daily, was also quite peculiar. Our commanders would come up, grab us by the shoulders, tilt our heads down sharply, and reward us with a slap or punch to the neck. If it was a slap, it was loud and humiliating. If it was a punch, it was just very painful. And the most unpleasant thing was that it looked like a fun show to everyone else. Everyone was laughing, and you, red-faced and hurt, went to redo your ill-fated collar so you wouldn't be embarrassed again. In general, there are so many varieties of such punishments in the Army that no single video or even book would be enough to list them all. Every officer, every foreman or sergeant knew how to bring something of their own to this repertoire of educational measures. But it always boiled down to two things: either physical exertion to the point of complete exhaustion, or engaging in some absurd but instructive nonsense. Sometimes it was even funny from the outside, but it wasn't funny for the soldier being punished. And you could be punished for anything. For making too much noise in the barracks in the evening, for talking in formation, for answering the commander incorrectly or confusing the terms "comrade captain" and "sir captain," and sometimes just for a minor oversight, such as an incorrectly sewn button or a crooked belt. And all this was presented under the slogan, "So that you remember."